I'm just going to give you a little bit of background on myself. My background, strengths really are in sales, okay, in sales and marketing. And I have a lot of kind of a broad spectrum of expertise, but probably the big thing that I share with my clients and I'm going to share with you guys is selling. Sales is so important. I got started right out of college. I was picked up very fortunately by the Tom Hopkins selling organization. Tom Hopkins is an international author, sales trainer, teacher, trainer, motivator, seminar giver, and I became a seminar coordinator for that organization in 1988, and it was amazing. We did 150 to 160 seminars a year. Most of those being one-day seminars, all day long seminars on sales training and motivation and so forth. And we always did a management session in the morning for how to recruit, train, manage, and motivate salespeople. And so I kind of tuned in, paid attention, and learned a lot. I was with the organization about 4 years. Then I started my own business, got into financial services, diversified financial services, starting out with loans and mortgages, and diversified into other financial products, insurance and securities and so forth. And always cross-sold my offerings to maximize my income and so forth. Did that for 25 years. Got a master's degree in strategic marketing or strategic management, a bachelor's in recreation administration, which was really the only thing I felt like I could pass to get through college. And I got my master's much later in 2014. And and that was an experience. But anyway, been with SBDC, Small Business Development, now for 7 years. And one of the things that's a common challenge that a lot of the businesses that I work with, and really all of you as well, is in the sales part of it. The sales part of I will tell you that the sales and marketing aspect of the business is the most important aspect of the business. It's the most important thing. And many of the companies I work with, many of the business owners that I work with, they know a service, they know a product, they're passionate about, maybe driving a truck or delivering a service or a value proposition, doing landscaping or pipe fitting and electricians and construction workers and you name it, retail and manufacturing and distribution and so forth. Many have skills in those areas, and they love it, and they want to start a business. They want to go into business, and they do. They go into business, and they know how to do the stuff. But many times we get stuck because they haven't really developed the sales part of it. And that's what I want to focus on here today. I want to focus on exploding the pipeline, because in this economy and with what we're doing now, what we're seeing now, I'm going to share my screen. Hopefully, you can see my screen at this time. With this economy that we're in, it's created a little bit of a funk. People are kind of locked. They've been locked down. They've been shut down. They've been limited. They've had, rules imposed that have slowed down their income streams, and many are struggling to get it reestablished and rebuilt. And we talk about this every day, the importance of exploding, building your sales pipeline. Now, I know, you may be really good, at driving a truck and strapping down a heavy load or an awkward load and hauling it, getting it someplace safety, or maybe you're a consultant and you do safety consulting. You really know that aspect, safety and risk management and asset management, that kind of stuff, and systems development, process improvement. Bottom line, you got to be able to sell it. You got to be able to sell it. And that's what we're going to talk about. Most of you may have already downloaded the handout that Chris posted on the network webinar page and so forth. I'm hoping that you have this already printed out. I'm going to jump back and forth. I'm going to move through a few different visuals with you. I want you to think about this webinar. I want you to think about what we're doing right now. We have you on a Zoom. We have your attention. We have control. I have control of what you see. When I do outreach and when I talk to people, I engage, I develop the conversation, I evaluate a need, establish a need, present a solution. I try to connect, get them to see me online so that I can control what they see on the desktop, so that I can toggle back and forth between whatever I want them to see that I can build value with, so that I can transition the conversation or control the conversation to create a client, create a valued client. And so you got to learn to use tech. You've got to learn to use your technology to improve your outcomes, to create speed to market, be able to engage, develop, convert, and fulfill in a call, in an instant, in 5 minutes. People don't have time today. And, I talk to a lot of, businesses, and, trust, I'm not asking anybody to chime in, but, for marketing, they think, well, I got to get some business cards. I got to get some flyers done up. I got to do a Facebook page and, and all this stuff. And I'm telling you, and I love y'all. But I'm gonna tell you that most of the stuff that you do won't work. It's not gonna work. Maybe some of it will, and it will for a little while, but then even that stops working. And one thing that I'm experiencing is old school outreach works. Everybody always wants a shortcut. Everybody wants to be able to, have a shortcut to, just anything that they can do to avoid making the calls. Okay. Anything that, that they can do to just not have to make the calls and engage. So they do a text message, or what can I do through email? What can I do, to get my information out there? Post something on Facebook, social media, etc. And folks, I'm telling you, if you want to explode your pipeline, you got to do it manually. And if you don't have a budget, you don't have a big marketing budget, you got to do it manually. And I guarantee you this will work for you. But before I do it, I want to tell you, can you guys see my screen? Thumbs up if you can see my screen, or Chris, somebody unmute and tell me.
We can.
Okay. So, and before I jump in, I want you to know I'm a bit of a hard case, and I apologize in advance. Sometimes I let a cuss word slip out accidentally, where I feel something or what have you. And so I'm gonna try my best not to do that. But being yourself is what works. I'm telling you, don't be scripted, don't be, a robot, etc. That doesn't, you've got to be yourself, and people can appreciate it. I'm going to tell you something. People answer their phone. People will answer their phone. They don't respond to email. They may not respond to a text message. They may not respond on your marketing stuff, but they answer their doggone phone. And so you have a unique opportunity to engage, attract, engage, develop, convert, and fulfill quickly, and do it time efficiently and effectively, rather than getting in. I mean, I came from Phoenix, and I lived in North Phoenix, and I had appointments all over. That's a big city. Mesa and Scottsdale and Tempe, Gilbert, Chandler, Glendale, Peoria, all that city's all spread out. And you set appointments, get in a car, drive an hour to get someplace, pull up, and then have the windows blinds shut, lights go out, no one answers when you knock on the door, you even confirm the appointment before you leave. You've got to be more effective and efficient with using the technology that you've got available to make it work, to serve needs. Don't be so selfish with your product or your service to isolate, a marketplace. you've got and only talk to a few people, you need to find a way to work the law of large numbers. You need to work the law of averages. And number one, when you get started here, let's keep it simple. You need a simple business plan, and that simple business plan is, number one, work when you're supposed to work. Okay. Number one, work when you're supposed to work. That means define what work is. Work isn't sitting and doing trinkets and making, the stuff or mixing up the mix for your bakery. That's not what I'm talking about. Work when you're supposed to work means engaging and developing your market, and doing it manually with every bit of time you have extra during the day. You've got to set time blocks to do this. Number two, don't diversify too soon. You can always cross-sell later. You focus on the main thing. What does Stephen Covey say? He says, the main thing, keep the main thing. Right? And that means find the product mover, the solution, the best solution that you have to deliver, and focus on that delivery, and, engage and develop that conversation, convert that conversation, and diversify later. You'll have plenty of time later for other offerings to answer, do you guys also do this, et cetera, et cetera. Yes. But focus first on delivering the main thing. You need to get a client, a customer now, and develop that customer, add on, sell later, add on diversified product. Stay focused. A lot of people, we're thinking, oh yeah, I can do this, I can do this, I can do that. And we also do this, we also do that. And what happens is you get people so confused on everything that you offer, they can't focus on just one thing. And they don't know one thing because you haven't compelled them or led them to the main thing and kept them on that solution. The problem is evident. You may have to shine light on the problem, but that keeping that solution in the forefront gives you the opportunity to develop the other cross-selling opportunities later. I used to make $300-400 on a transaction with a client, and I was pumped up. Man, I could do that all day, make $300-400, make $300-400. And then I started figuring out how I could make $1,000 on a client, make $1,000 per client, $1,000 per client. Then I figured out, wow, if I slow play this out and I don't diversify too quickly, I go on the main thing, and then I cross sell later. I make $10,000, $7,000, $8,000, $9,000 per client, and it takes 9, 10, 12, 13, 15 months to reel all that in. But it's in the pipeline. It's growing and expanding in the pipeline. And so I'm going to share a little bit of that stuff. Number one, so work regular hours, work when you're supposed to work. Don't diversify too soon. You can always cross sell later. Stay focused on the main thing. Build with sales. Build with sales. And if you're recruiting and expanding your organization, focus on building with sales and recruit, as a secondary type of thing. But you always are looking for opportunities to expand with good quality people that are passionate about what you're passionate about. And best way to do that is recruit your clients later, for referrals and so forth, or other people that may be looking to join your organization. Number 5, you got to enjoy what you're doing. You got to have fun. You got to love it. Right? You got to love it. You got to believe in what you do. You got to believe in your product. You got to believe in the solution. You got to believe in what you do and enjoy it. Have fun. The numbers game is always a numbers game. You may make, X number of contacts, and most of them say no. Welcome to the club. Most of them are going to say no. But the fact of the matter is, when you work the law of large numbers, some of them say yes. And if you're not working the law of large, you don't have any of those yeses. So my goal here today is to show you a very inexpensive, very cost efficient, very compelling attack strategy to explode your pipeline and get yourself making money every day on pipeline development, on churning out customers and so forth. Then number 6, don't self-destruct. Some of my clients are on this call, and they know that I hammer the point. You got to do your research. When you are going into business, you do your market research, you evaluate your competition, you evaluate the competitive environment and so forth. How many of your competitors did you call? yesterday? How many of your competitors did you, I'm talking about brand new startup, but how many of your competitors did you call and engage them and develop a conversation as a competitor to get some key information that would help you avoid some of the challenges that they had earlier on? And would that be a valuable call? Of course, it's a valuable call. So you have to do competitive analysis. You have to do market analysis. You got to know who your target market is. So I go 100 miles an hour and I get juiced. I get pumped about what I do every day. And I'm going to share some of that. Hopefully get, get some of this, get it to rub off on you, but you got to believe in what you're doing and be passionate, or nobody's going to listen to you. So I already understand you're passionate about what you do. I already understand that you believe in what you do, or you wouldn't be doing it. So now it's about filling the pipeline. And don't make 2-3 calls and self-destruct. Don't make 15 calls, 20 calls and self-destruct. Well, because I used to do this. It hurt my feelings when people hung up on me or got rude or whatever, and I would go, well, this ain't working, this just isn't working. I find a different way to do it. And I'm telling you that it's the same for everybody. You got to be able to deal with failure and rejection. You got to be able to handle the failure and rejection. One of the things that I did was I know exactly how many people I got to talk to get a yes, and I know how many yeses I need to get a sale, and I know how many sales I got to get to keep a sale on the book. And the way it worked for me was I had to talk to 20 people to get 10 of them to say yes, I'll listen for 30 more seconds. And I had to talk to those 10 people. And of those 10 people, 5 were still with me after a minute. Okay. And of the 5 that were with me after a minute, 2.5 of them said, yeah, I'll do that. I'm in. But one of them would ultimately change their mind. And that's how I ended up with a formula where I could keep a deal a day on the books and make anywhere from $500 to $5,000 a deal a day on the books that stays. The other half of those deals cancel, out of your control. And so when I say don't self-destruct, we have a tendency to fixate on the things that went wrong. The things that went wrong, and you lose sleep at night. Oh, you wake up in the middle of the night. Oh, geez, if I'd have just said this, man, that would have worked. If I would have said that, and you're losing sleep over the rejection. You got to learn how to deal with the rejection and plow ahead. So I'm going to share with you. So the form, that I downloaded on the, that's up on the, it's all typed out nice and pretty, and there's a lot of information on that page that we're going to get into at another time. We're going to focus today on the pipeline and the golden moment, but I do it in my own handwriting. I do it. I write my stuff out on one page, my whole life on one page, so I could have that all on one screen to affirm, to create an affirmation of what I'm doing, so I can stay focused and not listen to the no, not pay attention to the rejection, but to stay focused on driving forward and getting sales. Okay. And so I wrote it all up in a little nice little, in my handwriting. And I would encourage you to do it in your handwriting so that you hear it in your voice, so that when you read stuff that's in your handwriting, you hear it in your voice, and it reaffirms and strengthens your countenance, your courage, and your conviction, as opposed to just reading it off a typewritten paper, etc. And so I've kind of blown up a couple of those key concepts here, and I want to talk to you about that from this point forward. So I talk a lot about the golden moment. The golden moment is, when you sit down with your director, your business advisor, and you've gone through and you've started working on your business plan, and you're developing your strategy and talking about your marketing plan, and you're talking about all this stuff, and you're getting it down on paper and everything. I've done that. Your business plan is kind of preparatory to being able to develop your scripts. It is a script. When you write a business plan, you're talking about who you are, what you do, why you do it, and why your opportunity is compelling, why you're going to be successful, what you're going to do, and so forth. And you're going to show projections and stuff, talking about how this looks on, if financially, and that's all wonderful. But what that does is it solidifies your scripts in your brain. You've read it 100 times. As you write it, if you're like me, you're writing a business plan, and you write a sentence, and then the next time you open it and reread that sentence, you don't like how that sentence goes, and so you're restructuring the sentence. Maybe you cut it and paste it a little lower because maybe it belongs down here, and you build up to it, and you kind of build on to. That is developing your scripts. And in a sales business, this is all that matters, is engaging, developing, converting, and fulfilling clients. Engaging, developing, fulfilling, and converting and fulfilling clients. The doing the part, the buying the products and reselling or working on this, manufacturing that, and all that stuff's important. Driving the truck, mowing the lawns, all that stuff is critically important to completion. But bottom line is, you're the expert on that, but you got to get expert on the sales part of it. You got to get expert on gaining and retaining clientele. And so the business plan that you wrote is what helps you to develop this process. So I'm going to tell you, whenever you get on the phone, you're starting to make your attempts, you got to get your mind focused. You got to be focused on what you're going to do and eliminate all the distraction. Don't open your email. Don't look at your emails. Don't check your text message. Don't do anything. Block the time so that you can get your mind right and focus on your value proposition and delivering it to a massive number of people, one after the other, and be consistent. So I'm going to share this strategy with you. And before I do, I want you to think about those top three things. Those top three things, you see these highlights and you see, different colors and stuff. That's so that, and the way that that's set up is, your eyes will tend to go to different places when you're talking to people. And after years and years and years, I've kind of tracked where my eyes travel. And so I put things that are in different locations on the script or on the page to follow my eyes so that I stay on track. Number one, so I'm going to talk about the golden moment. This is so important. When you engage people, I'm going to give you a 6 minute. I believe that the sale happens in 5 or 6 minutes tops. You don't need an hour and a half presentation. I was in the mortgage business. In the mortgage business, you take an hour and a half with the client. In selling insurance, you take 45 minutes, an hour and a half. They don't have that kind of time. And people can appreciate if you are precise and concise and you use word economy in every word you share, so that you're able to help them capitalize quickly, understand there's a problem and understand the solution, and capitalize quickly and efficiently and effectively to be able to take advantage of your product, your service. It doesn't take much more than 5 or 6 minutes. So I'm going to kind of go through that. And this is the formula. Listen, I know it works. I know that it works. I don't know if you will work, but I know the strategy works. I know it from experience, and I know it by the back of my hand. If you work the strategy, you will do a deal a day, you will do a sale a day or more, because they compound over time. You got 3 buckets. You got a cold bucket, a warm bucket, and a hot bucket. And every conversation, even the ones that say no to you, still stay in the cold bucket. The ones that say yes, but they're not there, a minute later, they go into the warm or still stay in the cold bucket. The ones that say yes and then change their mind, they're warm. And the ones that are hot, who the hot ones are, that's pending business directly. And I knew from experience that if I planted 125 seeds a day, you're like farming, you're farming. Plant 125 seeds a day, make 125 calls a day. You'll talk to 25 people, 25 decision makers. You'll talk to 25 or 30 or 40 non-decision makers, and you won't get anywhere with those. They just stay in the cold bucket and for another attempt later on. But 125 seeds planted or calls made, you'll talk to 25 people. And of the 25 that you do talk to, 10 of them are going to say yes. Initially 10. Eventually you're so good that 10 or 11 or 12 will say yes. Initially though, 10 will say yes. And of the 10 that you develop, that's capturing a lead that are now transitioning into a warm bucket. Of the 10 that you capture, half of them are going to say, yeah, that's awesome. I want to tune in. Yeah, I'll connect up. I'll look at your Zoom. I'll open that link. Show me what you've got. And of those five, two of them are going to commit. I don't know what happens to the other two or three, but they start getting weak and they change their mind. Maybe we didn't strengthen the sale. Maybe we weren't pushing the hot buttons correctly. Maybe we missed an opportunity, but you can always reapproach in 90 to 120 days, 180 days, 6 months, a year down the road. And one thing I want you to realize, you don't just have 100 contacts or 100 in your market, or 200 in your market, or 300 in your market. You've got thousands and tens of thousands in your market. You've got, in fact, so many of your absolute perfect target market potential customers that you can only reach them once a year. So if you've got thousands in your database and you're spinning through that database, you won't get all the way through it for a year. And the second time you call them back, it was a year ago when you reached out, they are going to remember you, or maybe they will if they were in the warm bucket. The point is, of those two that commit, one of them probably is going to change their mind, but you're going to end up having that one deal stay on the books. And what that means to you, I don't know. I hope that means more than $5 on a sale. I hope it means more than, $11.50. And if it's $11.50 that you make on a sale, you need to reevaluate. You need to get with me, or you need to get with Carmen, or you need to get with one of our other directors. You need to get with that director, and you need to isolate who that market is in a much broader area, because you need lots of them, and you need to find a way to sell in bunches. So if you're only going to make $11.50 on a transaction, then you need to start approaching companies with 500 or more employees so that you can get 250 interested in 125 sales, where you make $11.50 on the 125, as opposed to pushing one t-shirt or one product. You need to scale it in your mind, and you need help doing that. And that's what we got experts in the network that we can help you do that. And each time they fall out, they go in a bucket. So they're either in the cold, warm, or hot bucket. And, one way you can kind of figure out, how to be positive with every rejection is, if you talk to 20 people and only get one deal to stay on the books, the ones that reject you, just be thinking, thanks for the $100. Thanks for the $100. Because every 20 that say, no, I got a deal on the book, I make $2,000 on the deal, thanks for the $100. Every rejection, you gotta be able to get your mind right and keep it right. So in the golden moment, this is the most critical, and we spend a lot of time with our clients. I want my clients to get with me and just master the golden moment, and that is the 6-minute sale. The 6-minute sale, you already did the business plan, and so you've got you've got the 45-minute presentation of your business, and you could now, once you've done the business plan, you could do a 20-minute segment on the news. You could do a 6-minute, an 8-10-minute segue on a radio show, and condense what you've had. Now you've got to be able to develop it into a process to convert a sale in 6 minutes, and that's what the golden moment's all about. So you have some different parts here. Again, it's in my handwriting, and it's back over here on your page, of what you're going to go through. You're going to do an intro with juice, enthusiasm in your voice, and they can feel it. You're smiling, when you smile, on your phone, they sense it, they feel it. Wow, they're smiling. I can tell they're happy with what they're doing. So introduction with, is your greeting with juice, your value proposition. You've all heard of your elevator pitch, your elevator, presentation, your elevator pitch. That's your value proposition. Clear and concise language. Hey, is this Bob? Bob, right? Juice in your voice. Scott Booker, I know you don't know me, but you referred to me a while back, and I just wanted to reach out. I'm working with companies doing boom, boom, and boom. Three things, okay? We'll go back to your focus. What are the top three things? Hey, is this Chris? Chris, Scott Booker over at SBDC. How you doing? Listen real quick. I know you don't know me, right? But you were referred to me, and I was actually working with companies right here in your area, helped do this, this, and this. And I wanted to check with you, see if you've been thinking about reevaluating what you're doing versus what you're actually getting in return for it, to see if you might be able to do a little bit better. You got 30 seconds real quick. Now he's probably just saying in his mind, what did he just, who, who you with? Right? They're all trying to catch up to you, but you are moving through the value proposition. And so it's a process of moving them through to engage and develop and convert, right? Understand your goal is to make a sale, not to get an email address. Your goal is to make the sale. And if you end up getting the email address, celebrate that. That's awesome. You captured some data, and you can always plug that into your automated system later on. So again, you got to have a solid intro. Hey, and juice, enthusiasm in your voice. You're going to do a 15-second value proposition, and you're asking a question where they're going to brush you off. They're going to blow you off, brush you off. Make up your mind and understand they're going to blow you off. Most of them will. And they're going to say the same thing over and over and over and over again, right? And it's two things. I'm not interested. I'm not interested. Or, oh, we're happy with what we're doing. I got a guy. We're happy with what we're doing. We're not going to change. So if you're prepared in advance and you understand you're going to get the brush off, I get it all the time. You will get it all the time. So then what is your response? What is what I call the blow by? It's very important, your blow by. And you can feel the conversation. You can feel this developing. And I'm going to go through it over and over and over again. Hey, is this Bob? Bob, Scott Booker with SBDC. How you doing? Listen real quick. I know you don't know me. You were referred to me. I'm working with companies, helping them do this, this, and this. I'm working with people, helping them with this, this, and this, right? What your top three values. And I just wanted to check with you, right? This is a transition. And I just wanted to check with you, see if you've been thinking about reevaluating what you're doing versus what you actually get in return, see if you might be able to do a little bit better. Now, I said that quickly, but checking to see if if you've thought about reevaluating what you're doing versus what you're getting in return, or what you're paying versus what you're receiving. See if you might be able to do a little bit better. You got 30 seconds real quick. They're going to say, I'm not interested. They're going to say, we're happy with who we're using, right? And I want you to write this down. Nobody, everybody. Nobody, everybody. Oh, no, I'm not interested. Well, Bob, nobody's interested in, whatever you're selling, right? Whatever you're selling. Nobody's interested in that, but everybody is looking for this, this, and that, aren't they? Right? The answer to that question is a clear and total yes, right? So it's your value proposition. It's your top three things, right? Oh, nobody, and everybody. Nobody's interested, Bob, but everybody's looking for this, this, and this, aren't they? Yeah, that's why I was calling, right? To check with you and see if we could reevaluate that. You got 30 seconds real quick, right? Now they're going to either brush you off one more time, or they're going to give you the 30 seconds. Okay. And when they say, well, yeah, I guess so. I put in a story. Okay. You make your value proposition. We're helping them with this, this, and this, right? Value proposition again. And then you tell the story. Chris, you're not alone. In fact, I was working with a guy just the other day. In fact, they got 4 employees. They're doing pretty good, in sales, but they're looking for ways to, improve their efficiency. In fact, what they were paying and what they were getting, they weren't all that thrilled. And what we did this and this, and man, they were pumped. So, right. And I used my voice, elevate my excitement. They were pumped, or they were juiced, or they were excited, right? Hey, Chris, if I could do that for you, Is that something that would help you out? And then shut up and let them answer you. Well, I hadn't really thought of it. I mean, maybe. Great. Are you online right now? Right? Are you online? Go to your email, open up your email, click the link, right? Boom. You got them on your desktop. What are we working on? A 6-minute sale. We're focused delivering your top 3 value propositions, your number 1 solution. And now we got them on our desktop where we can show them whatever we want them to see that creates a compelling opportunity for them. And we toggle and we give them those values and we're closing. If I could do that for you, is that something that would help you out? You got 6 minutes, we can go ahead and do a requisition or an invoice, or we can do an application or whatever, right? You're closing. So let me get back to did I just close out? Okay, I think I closed it out. So I'm going to have to use this one because I accidentally shut that other one off. Value proposition close. Have you thought about reevaluating? Tell a story. The story, you guys most people don't like, Phil, they don't like the pressure of selling. I don't want to I don't want to be a car salesman, used car salesman, or insurance. They're high pressure, never always, closing on me. Tell the stories. Hey, Chris, I was working with this guy the other day. In fact, same situation. They got this, and this, and what they were experiencing. And you're talking about, efficiency or a better process or a better way to solve it, or simplification of a complicated issue, and, or technology or whatever you do. So you're thinking, you're delivering your story, your value proposition in a story. And, and this was a situation, this was the problem. So then what we did was we did this, we evaluated, we assessed, we implemented, and what they got, man, it blew. They were so juiced up, pumped up about it. They saved tens of thousands of dollars. Hey, right? Trial close. Hey, Bob, hey, Chris, if we were able to do, if I could do that for you, is that something that would help you out? Yeah, I guess it would. Great. Close the deal. Great. We can go ahead and set this up. You got 2.5 minutes, 3 minutes. And many times they're going to wig out. But so what? It doesn't matter. You're working the law of large numbers. That 6-minute process done, repeated repeated over and over and over again, is how you work the law of large numbers for free with activity in a qualified market. When I say qualified, you need to get with me for an advanced session to identify, if you haven't already identified your target market. And if you already have identified your target market, you got to get with me so that we can go over how to use that market. I was working with a guy, I'm telling you a story, all right? And the business approach is to builders only, okay? Builders, home builders, custom home builders, track home builders, master plan developers, and so forth. So I got in our resources. We all have this. We all, SBDC is, we got it, and we can pull this up. And so I pulled up all of the builders in a 5-state region here in New Mexico, Arizona, Texas, Oklahoma, Colorado. I think Utah's in here as well. You see the states and stuff. And I only wanted the big ones, okay, for the client. They wanted the cream. You can struggle and work with a one-on-one that's not even in a qualified market, and you waste so much time talking to the wrong people that if you really want to target, so again, we bypass the small fish and we're going right to the cream of the crop, the cream of the marketplace. Meritage Homes, Philippe Lord owns it. He's the CEO in Scottsdale, Arizona. And, he's coded as a builder. The phone number is in the record. Their website is in the record as well. I can scroll through and see how they do residential homes, but they also may do general contracting. They have multiple standard industrialized classification codes. They have multiple NAICS codes. You go into NAICS when you signed up, you had to come up with, figure out what your NAICS code was. So the NAICS codes are all listed all the way across this sheet. Information about that company and what they do, that I can study it. I can look at it with a glance, and I can scroll all the way across. I know exactly who I'm talking to, what points I'm making. They got 100 to 250 employee range, but exactly 130 last year. They had 75, they had 150, they had 150 employees, they had 480 employees, 75, 100, et cetera. This is their location sales, 53 million, 52 million, 31 million. I don't know about you, but I want to talk to people that are making money. I don't want to talk to the ones that aren't making any money at all because they can't afford to pay me, and they can't afford to buy the solution, buy the product, the service, et cetera. You want to talk to the ones that are doing something, but that can do better, and that you're able to add to that tool. So that information's all public record, by the way. We've just pulled it. And we narrow it into a database. We can figure out if they're privately owned, publicly owned, stock traded, et cetera. Their EINs, their established date, the square footage of their building. Okay, is that valuable information? I mean, is that something that can help the square footage of their building? How about their budget? Here's all the board members. Think about this. You call them up. Hey, is this Brent? No, Brent's not in right now. Oh, okay. Is Doug around? No, Doug's with him. Well, let me talk to Robert then. Robert's not in. Then is Derek available? Right? You got all the names. Okay. So I'm talking about stacking the deck. All right. When I was in the financial service industry, I knew exactly who I wanted to talk to. I wanted to talk to people that were 3 years younger than myself to 5 years older than myself. And I don't have a reason for that. I just identified with them that when they were around my same age bracket. Again, financial sales is a difficult thing. It's a little bit complicated. But I needed to talk to people that were 48 to 53, married, male, head of household, making $150,000 a year or more, with $100,000 in assets or more, with a mortgage of more than $200,000, and a phone number scrubbed against a do not call list, and a presence of children living at home. So that was my target market. Why? So I could have a very focused and very short, very precise, very concise 15-second value proposition to convert on a higher probability, because I didn't have time to talk to, just anybody that can fog a mirror out of the phone book, or anybody that, any people that are just, they're good people, but you don't have time. There's not enough time in the day to talk to all of that. You need a very targeted, very highly targeted, high probability qualified market to talk to, and not waste so much time in unqualified markets. And so that's what I'm talking about. I just pulled this up, home builders, and the data is awesome. Some of these companies got 20, 30 people in their boards of directors, and it's great to drop names. Okay. I mean, if you can drop names, that's phenomenal. We also know how much they spend on accounting, how much they spend on advertising, how much they spend on their computers, how much they spend on labor, how much they spend on legal, how much they spend legal. You can tell who's getting sued, right? And who's not, who's got issues, out of compliance. I don't know your gig. I don't know what you're doing, all of you, but I'm telling you that if you have a highly targeted market, your probability of success is much better. And if you only have 11 in your city, you need to expand your thinking. You need to expand to your state. You need to expand, by cities, and get dense populations that you can market to in highly qualified markets, and ship your product. You need to scale the idea, scale the concept, sell in bunches, sell 500 at a time instead of one at a time, or two at a time, or six at a time, or whatever. I don't know, if you're selling hats and jerseys, you should be, why not be, goodness sakes, hockey teams, football team, pro, semi-pro, minor leagues, every single one of them, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of highly qualified general managers making that decision. And you do a 6-minute pitch and pick up, 150, transactions at $100 a piece. I mean, that's a 10,000, that's a big sale, right? So scaling and Marketing to the right markets is key. And don't ever give up. A lot of a lot of you think, well, how in the hell you do? I can't even. I use my cell phone, and I can't dial that many calls. It's annoying to even do it. And so you need a platform. You need a platform so that you can, power dial. You got an hour a day, you got an hour and a half, you got 2 hours a day to power dial. You need a power dial. You don't need to be sitting punching numbers, etc. You set it and forget it. Turn it on and go. Load up your numbers and start power dialing. One after the other after the other. You make a contact, you resolve the call, it goes to the next. You can schedule a call back, send a text message, send an email, do it all from your platform. If you're not getting into the technology, then what are you? Then you're getting left behind. This is not expensive. I mean, HubSpot's got a free platform, and Zoho's got another CRM platform that you can dial from. I use a paid one because I don't have a home phone. It all goes out on the cloud. It tracks everything, doesn't slow your computer down. It's fast. You can dial 150, 250, 300 dials a day. If you did it 8 hours a day, you talk to 40, 50, 60 decision makers and get 3-4 sales a day on the books. If you're not using a platform, you need to start looking at that and how you can get something in your organization. You can get something you can do so that you get better and you can teach somebody later on, so that maybe you replace yourself and so that you focus on other, some other aspects of your business. But this is an aspect that cannot be neglected. It cannot be neglected. Where are we at on time? We're out of time. No, we're not. We're still okay. You got to be able to kind of back away from 100 miles an hour that I'm going and see that it can be simplified for your opportunity. Get your mind right. Focus on your top 3 value propositions. Your wording of your elevator pitch. Everybody says, oh, this is real important. Man, I'm telling you, it's absolutely critical that you can say it without all the the gap filler words. Nobody has time for it. You got to be very precise and compelling in moving in getting your value proposition across. And of course, it's not going to sell everybody. It's not designed to. It's a law of large numbers. That way you can make you can make the number of contacts you need to. You figure it out. How much do you need to make? How much do you want to make? You want to make $10,000 a month? You want to make $120,000 a year? Well, break it down. I don't know how many sales that is. But if you break it down to how many sales it is, then you can figure out a way to do the activity on a daily basis to create the daily results that compounds to 10,000 a month, 15,000 a month, 20,000 a month, 30, 40, 50,000 a month. Just you. And it's not rocket science. 6-minute process, intro, value proposition, blow by the brush off, value proposition with a story. Tell the story. That's what creates the compelling interest. I was working with this guy the other day. In fact, their situation and blah, blah, blah. And they were so pumped. In fact, there was this other guy. Right now, I'm going to tell a second story. And and you just tell the stories of your sales. And they love it. That's what sells them. You don't have to sell them on it. You can tell stories of how others have enjoyed your value proposition. It makes them want it. You don't have to high pressure. You just simply say, hey, Bob, if I could do that for you, is that something that would help you out? And if we could do something like that, is that something that would help you out? Yeah, great. Are you online? Boom. Open up your email, right? Connect, you see a face, get the rich virtual. I've been doing virtual now for 20 years. Virtual is how you add richness. There's nothing like face-to-face, but you know what? In this world, in this day and age, you can't you can't go walking and knocking on doors and walking in and trying to talk to the decision. Who has that kind of time? Who has that kind of time to get blown off every single time? Oh, no, he's busy. or to go show up for an appointment, and you confirm the appointment, you show up and, oh, you didn't get his email, something came up, blah, 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 blah. Man, I'm telling you, if you want to collapse timeframes and you want to start making money, you got to fill your pipeline now. And this isn't the only way, but I'm saying an hour, 2 hours dedicated effort a day converts into $1,000. You'll find a way to do it more and do it more often. And that's even if it's not in the phone, even if you learn how to do a 6-minute presentation with an intro, your value proposition, the top 3 things, the question, the brush off, blow by, the confirmation that you blew by the brush off, tell a story, tell a second story if you need to, ask a closing question, if I could do that for you, is that something that would help you out, etc. Simple process. Yeah, that would help us out. Great. Are you online right now? What's the goal of the call? It's to get them to see you face to face or connect, or to be able to share your top 3 value propositions. And you got your little, I don't know if you can see when I'm hovering, what I've got open down on the bottom, but on the bottom of my screen, I've got 5, 6, 7, 8 things open, but minimized, so that as you develop your conversation, you can pull up, exactly answering, moving towards what they're interested in, etc. And then be accountable. Your platform keeps me, my platform keeps me accountable. My platform tracks the number of calls that I make, the number of contacts that I make, the amount of talk time I have on each call, who went in the cold bucket, who went in the warm bucket, who went in the hot bucket, did I make a sale, how many scheduled callbacks do I have? Do I have, how many callbacks, are, in the queue for callbacks? All of that stuff is all done in the platform. And the technology is awesome, but at old school, I used to track, okay, how many calls did I make? I'd have these little tick marks right here, 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, 45, 50, 55, 60. How many messages and voicemail did I leave? 5, 10, 15, 20. How many contacts did I make? 10. How many did I get through the full, 15-second value proposition? They get a mark there. How many brushed me off that I blew by? They get a mark there. After that, did I get to give my 30-second quote? If so, yes. How many stories did I tell? 1, 2, 3 stories a day. Pretty soon, I was able to jump right to only measuring, okay, how many stories did I tell today? Because if I told 4 stories, I wrote 2 sales, and of the 2 sales I wrote, 1 would cancel and 1 would stay on the books. So my goal was to get 4 stories. Forget all the rest of the stuff. I got to get 4 stories today. Tell 4 stories with a decision maker. Keeps your mind focused and right, instead of beating yourself up and going off to the refrigerator. Oh, that hurt my feelings. They weren't very nice to me, or whatever. Dwelling on, what they said. I don't even hear it until I hear the right response. I know they're going to brush me off. Well, nobody's interested in Bob, but everybody's interested in saving money, making more money, or, doing so more efficiently, aren't they? Yes, great. That's why I was calling. I wanted to check with you, see if you thought about reevaluating what you're doing versus what you're getting in return, right? Same. This is easy for me. I've done it thousands and thousands of times, but you need to get polished in your process, right? So that you are automatic. There was 4 levels of competency in sales, 4 levels of competency in sales. The unconscious incompetent is the beginning level, where you don't even know you don't know what you're doing. The conscious, or the consciously incompetent level, is when you now know, you really don't know what you're doing. And then you get to the conscious competent, where you become good at what you're doing, but you got to stay focused, and you got to stay consciously aware of where you're at all times, so that you're moving through for those results. And the unconscious competent is where it's automatic. It's automatic. Every single call, automatic. Unconsciously competent um, streamlined efficiency, effective wording. Everything is compelling, good juice. Everything is timing, and you move through. And so practice makes perfect. Perfect practice makes perfect. The 5 steps of the learning process: impact, repetition, impact, repetition, utilization, internalization, and reinforcement. As you move through the learning process, repetition becomes the mother of learning. Do you do it often? Are you cutting corners? What are you not doing that you should be doing? If what I'm doing right now should be published on the news, in the newspaper, would I be proud of what I'm doing right now? Be focused on the results. Be focused on the right activity. So, and this is an hour, 2 hours a day. You can tell me you don't need to do this. That's fine. Some of you don't. You wish you had me banging out calls for you. You wish you had me doing that for you every day, day in and day out. If that's the case, you need to be doing this, right? You need to be doing it. It's outreach and it's branding. It's your brand. You come back a year later and you're calling. You don't have to call them back every week. You don't have to be like the guy that's like has 15 contacts or 15 business cards. They shuffle through the business cards every day and call them up. Are you ready yet? Because you only have 15, and it's like, oh my gosh, if I have to throw one business card away, I'll be down to 14. You need thousands. And you need to be able to keep going and blowing, because the high probability ones only need 6 minutes to make up their mind. They don't want to take hours to do it. They want it done in a short period. They want to be able to make a decision that helps the company, that solves a problem, that saves them money, that's more efficient, that reduces risk, that reduces liability, that improves the process, that speeds up delivery, that does whatever you do. They want it, but they don't want to take 2 hours to evaluate. They know what they need. They know what they want. You know it too. Do it in 6 minutes and be respectful of their time, and then be really attentive to your follow-up, real attentive to your follow-up, and diligent. I don't use the paper tracking anymore, but there it is. I don't use these anymore. It's there for reinforcement. I know exactly where I'm at every moment, but we need to take the time to get it all down so that we can flow through 6 minutes. 6 minutes verbatim. When you can do that, you can do an all-day seminar like Tom and get up on the stage and have the same pauses, the same laughs, the same jokes, the same delivery and punchlines, the same, voice inflections and so forth. That's the mastery of your vehicle. You chose the vehicle you chose for a reason. You can be the very best in the world with that vehicle. You can make money with that vehicle, and you're passionate about that vehicle. Then you just got to focus on making that value proposition available to the masses. And if you don't have a big advertising budget, what are you going to do? You got to do it on your own and build it from the ground up. Eventually you get one person, eventually you get 2, you get 5, you got 20 people. Pretty soon, geez, man, you might even have a whole call center, and you're doing $45-50 million a year in business, $60 million a year. A lot of my clients would be happy making, 10,000 a month, 5,000, 2,000 a month, right? It starts with this. Get your mind right. Top 3 value propositions. Be a closer. Be diligent. Be courageous. Be persistent. Be professional. Be courteous, and so forth. And be serious about what you do. Be serious about your value proposition. People can't just dismiss if they answer the question wrong of well, nobody's interested in this, Bob, but everybody's looking to reduce risk, increase their profits, and, improve their efficiency, aren't they? And if they answer that incorrectly and say, well, no, then you stand your ground. Either you're passionate about what you do and you're tenacious about the solution, or you just wimp out. Why not try a brush off, right? What? Are you no, you don't know of anybody that would be interested in those three things, right? Okay, that's fine. And next, move on. Call them back in a year. Hey, Bob, I talked to you about a year ago. We specialize in this, this, and this. And, you'd mentioned this and you'd mentioned that nobody's interested in this type of thing. I was just checking with you, see if you thought about rethinking your strategy, right? Another year went by, right? Just you've been thinking about rethinking your strategy. I'm working with a lot of, and you'll have more stories to tell. You'll have more to relate to. And they're like, holy crap, I can't believe you called me back, right? All right.
Perfect, Scott. Thank you for that lovely presentation. Since we're at time, do you want to take some Q&A?
Yeah, let's do that.
There was a question in the chat. They were asking if they could have access to the other documents that you showed on the screen.
You can have access to, okay, so these, am I sharing?
Yes, you are.
The ones that I'm not going to give you the Excel spreadsheets are highly defined market lists and stuff. So I would rather design a custom market type list for your business. Depending like, for example, I mean, this one I do a lot of oil field support type businesses. And, I ran a report, a list of all of the rental equipment supply companies from 150 miles from Artesia, New Mexico. Okay. So, and, full information and all of that as well. I want to do a custom, but those two Excel spreadsheets, there's hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of records. I would rather do a custom instead of wasting, so that you can be focused. Okay. But all the other documents that I shared, I'm happy to, I don't know how to get them to you. I can email them over to Chris, and he can make them available on the, wherever he puts those forms.
That would be perfect, Scott. Yes, email them to me and I'll email them out to everybody, and I will make them available along with the other sheet that's online.
Okay. Sounds good. I hope that answered that. Any other questions?
Let's see. Nothing in the chat right now. Let's see. Let's look at the message here. What changes in this do you see when our business is a business to person type rather than a business to business type?
Right. It's a, that's a unique challenge. I did it for years and years, business consumers, and hey, that's going to be a struggle for you. It doesn't mean that it isn't doable. It's very doable, but you got to watch you got different hours, business consumer. People don't answer. If you can get their cell phones, that's one thing. Being able to get those dialable cell phone records. Every business owner is a consumer. Okay. Every business owner is a consumer. So what stops, and every business owner answers their phone when it rings. And there are, okay, let's just say in New Mexico, and Texas, Arizona, whatever, there's hundreds of thousands of,
Scott, I'm sharing. I'm going to put up your contact information.
All right, fine. So where I was getting at that is, you got to have a do not call list account, so that you can upload your phone records into the do not call registry on a monthly basis to sift out the ones that have been put on the do not call list, because violations are very expensive. Calling people at home is a gamble. Most of the time they don't answer their phone. You end up leaving messages on voicemail, which is fine, on their answering machines, etc. That's fine. your probability of contact is more difficult. So a lot more of you that are in a business consumer market, or you're using social media, you're using other forms of marketing to try to capture those markets. And it's a fleeting market. It's a fleeting market, capturing their attention and keeping their engaging them, and watching all of the activity, engaging communication. It's very time consuming. I don't like it because I don't have time to, mess around with all the likes and the shares and, hey, what'd you like most about it? And, it's, I don't have time. It's not even real. You have no idea on the other end of that if they're even qualified. But in businesses, a list of businesses, like for example, oh, you like women's, you sell wigs, wigs. All right, so all right, fine. I'm gonna run a search for all the female business owners, um, within a 500-mile radius that are doing more than $1 million a year in sales, have 2 to 5 employees, not too big because I don't want to be, the run around through gatekeepers, 2 to 5 employees or less, maybe 1 or 2 or 3 employees or whatever, that are doing $1 million or more in sales a year with a phone number. I don't want to talk to lawyers. I don't want to talk to insurance agents. I don't want to talk to schools. I don't want to talk to libraries or public offices or government officials. I only want the businesses that are not one of those, or whatever, and pull that list. And then guess what? They answer their phone when they ring, and they're consumers. High probability, highly qualified consumers making money, saving money, need a wig. Maybe they don't. When you be age selective, you can, prospect in that way. But consumer market, I'm permanently banned from Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. They don't want me on there. I don't, even like them anymore. And they don't like me. So, but it works for a lot of people. Um, but you can get consumer lists and you can mail them. That's expensive. With a stamp, I mean, pretty soon stamps are going to be 60 something cents. That's expensive. Piece of mail, a phone call is just free, or you spend maybe 20, 30, 40 bucks, on a platform a month, and unlimited. Um, and you can go with the bigger, say, women's organizations all across the United States, or associations, um, karate associations all across the country, or I want only minority owned businesses, or I only want to talk to Hispanic owned businesses, or I only want to talk to African American owned businesses. And you need 15,000 records to talk to, then you have to expand and go to bigger states, et cetera. And you'd be taught all African American women own businesses with a phone number. Figure out who the target market is, and we talk about how to isolate and develop a high probability farm. Next question.
How do you feel about going into business and introducing yourself or your company, and leaving branded items like pens, papers, cups, etc.?
I don't like it. I think it's cheesy. I think it's just a waste of money and time. If you're not engaging, that's going right in the trash can, and you spent money on that pen. Um, it's one thing, walking into places and handing them something. But how do you feel about somebody walks into your business, hands you a pen, and is still standing there in front of you wanting to talk to you? How do you feel about it? Yet, and how many businesses nowadays have, no soliciting signs, and, they have a screener specifically out there in front to blow you off. I don't want to talk to any salesman or whatever. I don't like it. I think it's not much, one step above leaving flyers on windshields at Walmart. It's litter in the city.
Thank you, Scott. And yes, I have a collection of those pens on my desk. Um,
Yeah, I got SBDC pens too. I don't even give them out. I mean, people take them, but
Somebody else asked, what do you use to pull those lead lists?
We use Data Axle, Reference USA Gov. It's a proprietary program that we have a subscription to. The state of New Mexico SBDC network has a subscription to, so that we can work with our clients with it. And I think you can, if you wanted to buy, lists, there's scads of list companies. We're fortunate, to be able to help our clients with really specific and information and data. I mean, it's a gold mine. I spent $1,500 a month on lists back in the day. And I mean, I had 50,000 records in my dialing funnel, and divided by 15, in $1,500 increments, I get about 3,000. I mean, I was paying a lot of money for those records, and you can spend that kind of money too, to get records, but you can work with your SBDC office and you can dial it in, at no cost or at very little at our cost. We pay for the membership, so, we can help you out with that. It helps to know, those, well, you know what, we need a special session to kind of figure that market out and show you how we can dial in exactly who you want to talk to and get rid of exactly the ones you don't want to talk to. I can't tell you how many times, I dial out and I get lawyers. I don't want to talk to lawyers. They're nice people, but I just can't convert them. So I don't want to talk to them. I don't have time.
Okay,
Right?
Scott, we have two more questions.
Sure.
What is the best method to begin a life insurance agency funnel?
What is the best method to begin a funnel for a life insurance agency?
That's right.
Identify your target market. Identify who you're selling to, and don't tell me it's everybody. It's not everybody. And it's not 25 to 55, married people with kids. It's not that. You want to build a life insurance agency, you want to know exactly who you want to target, right? 48 to 52, married, male, homeowner, head of household with a phone number scrub, making this much, saving this much, with kids living at home, et cetera, with a phone number scrubbed. I mean, you need to know who your target is, and we can help you do that.
That's a great insight. Yeah, I'm single, no children. I probably don't need life insurance, Scott. So you're right on there. And then the last question we have time for: what do you think about selling more products than I have? So say I have 10 and I sell 100 to get the deal, but I know I can borrow to get the deal done. So what's your opinion on that one?
All right, rephrase it one more time.
Let's go through it again. Hold on. What do you think about selling more products than you have? So they're overselling.
Okay, wait. You know what? You don't make promises you can't keep, and you don't promise fulfillments that you can't fulfill, and you don't diversify too soon. Start with the main thing. It's okay to have multiple products as a main thing. For example, it's okay to have 10 products that fall into one thing. Okay. But the main push, if you're selling stuff you can't fulfill or you don't have, what a waste of time. Develop the customers for the things you do have, and take orders for later on, or channel those into your follow-up bucket in 3 months. You got a 30-day bucket, a 60-day bucket, a 90-day bucket, a 120-day bucket. And you cycle through your follow-ups based on the bucket and maturity, the itch cycle for the product, and deliver it at that time. And you always dedicate the time it takes to go through that list, daily, weekly, monthly. And everybody's business is a little bit different. But I mean, if you've got a consumable item that has a 90-day itch cycle, then you got to follow up in 90 days. I know that probably is a vague answer to the question, but don't get yourself in trouble with you know, having all kinds of conversations about future stuff that isn't yet on the table, sell what's on the table, um, and, uh, and develop that later. There's nothing wrong with having a be back for a diversified sale or another basket, another bucket, another solution, um, down the road. And when you've already branded yourself, it's a lot easier to sell a referral or a customer than it is to develop one from cold to hot to a transaction.
Perfect, Scott. I think that's all we have time for. We're at 12:47. If you'd
Wow.
if you'd send me those documents, I'll make sure everybody on the attend or on the list gets them. And I want to thank everybody for joining us and remind you that you'll get a survey following this presentation. So please do that for us. And Scott, final word from you.
I really, hey man, I'm proud of all of you. Hey, if you're still on this call, there's about 20 of us. I'm still on the call. Hey, I'm proud of you. And, I want you to know that, you know, it isn't easy. We all know, what we really should be doing and what we need to get better at. And I always, I'm pretty good at what I'm doing, but I'm always improving. Everything I've learned yesterday, I plug it into today and apply it today. Everything I learned the day before, I implement and get better and improve and strive to improve. And I know you do as well. And it's okay to be starting out not knowing, at the unconscious incompetent level and moving to the consciously competent level, um, in a short window of opportunity, to get better every day. And I'm proud of y'all for doing that and plugging in. And we're going to do an advanced class here in the not too distant future. It'll come out. Keep an eye out for it.
Perfect. Thank you,
All right.
Scott. And if no, without further ado, I'll end the session for anything. If you need anything from Scott or I, his information was on the screen, and you could always contact me and I could send that to you. Bye for now, everybody.
See you guys.